What's up, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Officer Training School. My name is Joushi Howard, and today we're going to be doing something a little bit different than what we've been doing in most of our Officer Training School videos in the past. Typically, whenever I've had one of these videos, we have mostly been talking about a single unit and how to use it effectively in the Guard. However, today we're going to be doing something a little bit more holistic. There's been a recent surge of posts going on places like the Reddit and my Discord where people start asking, how do I have a good game plan? What general things am I trying to do over the course of a game? And how can I generally build myself up in a way that I'm expected to have a bit more success? So to start off this video, I really want to start with one of my favorite quotes from Nick Jagiello, one of the strongest players who currently plays in Canada and is going to be representing the Guard at the World Championships 2024. And Nick said, "I haven't looked at what my opponent is deploying where in tournaments in months. My plan is stronger than theirs is." And I think this goes against a lot of the established wisdom that you generally tend to hear, especially from a lot of other Guard players on places like Reddit and Discord, where there's a lot of focus on how you can use things like the Lord Solar redeploy and how you need to be reacting to how your opponent is deploying their pieces. However, what I'm about to present here today is a general default game plan that is going to work for a vast majority of normal-ish looking Guard lists. And by that, I mean a list that is going to be doing the bulk of its damage via a number of Lehman Russ or Rogaldorn tanks or anything that has to do direct fire. And to make sure that our opponent's list do not get into melee with our big tanks, generally is going to be running some kind of screen. This can be Catachine on Chimeras. The example in this video is going to use Bulgrin, but it could just be a mob of infantry or other smaller vehicles that are going to be in front of your main damage dealers. Of course, I'm going to be making comments about what other options exist and things that I would have done slightly differently had I made different list building choices. But one of the major things that I want to focus on about this video is that the specific examples that I'm giving are way less important than the why. The what is nowhere near as important as the why. Don't get too caught up on specific things that you see. Think about why I'd be making these kind of decisions. In particular, something that I'm going to try with this one, let me know if it's something you like in the comments and if you find it useful, is I'll be throwing a couple of questions down in the lower right, and then I'll be throwing up some answers on my Ko-fi page so you can go ahead and check that out. Simply by asking yourself these questions, you should become a better Guard player overall. So in general, when we go for our deployment, what we are mostly trying to do is trying to figure out what our army really should look like if it gets one movement phase. This is important to mostly focus on having the one movement phase because in half of the games that we play, our opponent will go first and they will be able to bring in deep strikers and reserves on turn 2 before we get access to our second movement phase. A couple general principles that you should be thinking about is 1, you should deploy such that almost your entire army is not shootable on turn 1, and you should also assume that your opponents are good enough to do the same. We want to deploy such that we can score a lot of secondaries, screen opponents' reinforcements, and turn 1 and 2 charges, and also threaten and control firing range, and also set ourselves up to stage our own charges, which actually is very common in a lot of Guard lists today. So let's go over the list that I'm going to use as the examples of how I generally think about going for deployment and turn 1 movement. The list that you're going to be seeing today is a list that I took to the Hammer of Wrath GT, where I went 3 and 2, beating Ben Jurek, and got 17th out of 60 players. The list includes Lord Solar, attached to a Cadian command squad and a unit of 10 Cadians, Gaunt's Ghosts, 2 Tempestus command squads and 10 Signs with as much Meltdown Plasma as you can pack into them, 3 units of 6 Bulgrin, 1 Hellhound with an Inferno Cannon and a Heavy Bolter, 1 Exterminator, and 2 Rogaldorn battle tanks. This list is a fairly elite list as far as Guard tends to bring. It actually has a really low unit count overall, especially for Guard lists. However, the exact list matters a lot less than the principles. Use this as examples and see how you can extrapolate them to your own list. I'll do a little bit of that for you as we go, but don't get too caught up on the exact units that you see on this board. The map that we're going to be looking at is Pariah Nexus Terrain Layout 1. You will oftentimes hear this called Games Workshop terrain in different places on the internet. Whatever it's called, this is a very common layout that you will see in tournaments, particularly in the US and parts of Europe. For the purposes of this video, we're going to be stripping down a lot of things that would make you make different decisions. So we'll assume it's a simpler mission like Take and Hold or Scorched Earth, something where you're just trying to control a couple of objectives. And we're going to be using the deployment Crucible of Battle. Ultimately, I could have made a variety of different assumptions here as to exactly what terrain layout it is and what the deployment zones actually look like. Again, the point is not the specifics. You're going to be trying to think about how you can generalize these thoughts for any kind of map that you're playing on. It is important to note that the terrain that you are playing on is likely to differ to some degree depending on your local meta and terrain availability. Just because this video is focusing on Games Workshop or Pariah Nexus terrain does not mean the principles are not true in WTC or UKTC terrain as well. So starting at the end, this is what the deployment of many of my games would look like on this kind of terrain and deployment zones. And you have to keep in mind that I also have 2 big units of Scions held in Deep Strike as this massive threat that I could potentially put anywhere on the board on turns 2 or 3. A couple of important things to note that you will have to check with your TO or your opponent before you start a game, or at least before you deploy in a given game. There is a gap where the Leman Exterminator can move between the 2 buildings that it's standing next to, and also at the event, my Rogel Thorn was able to move along the southern border of the wall. Check with your TO with both of these things because it will affect how you end up deploying some of these units. As the first Kofi question I want you to think about, do you think I would deploy this in the exact same way against an army with no shooting? In general, this deployment assumes our opponent has at least some shooting that we need to respect. Going in roughly the order that we tend to think about a lot of these pieces, the first thing that we generally have to do is after the defender roll-off, we have to determine how many infiltrators we have and how many infiltrators our opponents have. In this particular example, I only have Gaunt's Ghosts, and I also have no scout moves. But you have to ask yourself, do we want to block out our opponent's infiltrators, or do we want to protect our own scout moves? For an army like Votann that can potentially use its pioneers in order to have a really big alpha strike on turn 1, you generally want to protect your own scout moves with an army like that. However, in the Guard, we don't have that kind of ability to alpha strike in 10th edition, so it's usually more important to deny their infiltrators. However, especially if you have a lot of scout in your army, it can be worth it to bring a couple more infiltrators or Gaunt's Ghosts to protect your own scout moves. In general, you're going to want to string out your infiltrators as long as they can be so that your opponent cannot deploy their infiltrators on their natural objective. And the natural objective is simply the one that is easier for your opponent to stand on than it is for us to stand on. In general, this blocks out a lot of our opponent's easy move blocking tools, as well as forces them to move something onto this objective later on, instead of just putting something cheap there and never having to think about it again. It's oftentimes very easy for infiltrator units to stand on these objectives in places where it is nearly impossible to dig them out. We want to force our opponent to move onto them rather than just let them do it and not have to think about it. The inverse of this that I want to ask in the Kofi is, why don't we usually put Gaunt's Ghost on our natural objective? If it's so easy for infiltrator units to just stand on this objective and not think about it. The next thing that we need to think about is, how do we screen our castle? And the castle is basically any setup of terrain where we have our home objective completely hidden, and there's a couple of terrain pieces by which it is impossible to shoot at anything inside the castle. On Games Workshop Pariah Nexus Terrain Layout 1, the castle is huge. On some other terrain layouts, it's going to be a lot smaller than this one. But the Lord Solar unit is huge, and you can reasonably screen out all 9-inch deep strikes in your castle while still maximizing Lord Solar and the Platoon Arcadian Commander's order range. The closest guy to the corner is about 9 inches away, depending on how large our opponent's smallest tools are to deep strike. You can spread this out even further if you want to. You just have to be careful with what angles you're exposing them to. But I see a lot of new players in particular are just going to bunch this unit up such that it doesn't actually do a very good job of screening. The Kofi question for this page is, how does playing Cadians versus an infantry squad versus playing Catachans as the Lord Solar bodyguard change how you would potentially move these models? It's important to note that in this video, I'm using a Lord Solar and his bodyguard in order to do this. However, if you're bringing, say, 2 Basilisks or a couple of Manticores or a couple of Field Ordnance batteries, they can do this exact same job and allow Lord Solar to move more freely on the board later. Okay, now that we've looked at the things that we have to do without even thinking about it at all, we have to start asking ourselves what we want to do on turn 1. And one of the very easy things that we want to be able to do on turn 1 is score every point that the cards dictate we can. So secondaries that we want to be able to deploy to score if we go first include Area Denial and Establish Locus, Containment, Cleanse, Secure No Man's Land and Extend Battle Lines, Recover Assets and Sabotage, and Engage in all fronts depending on what your deployment zones look like. If you're on Search and Destroy, you absolutely need to be able to do this. However, if you're playing on Hammer and Anvil or Dawn of War, it's a little bit harder to make this happen sometimes. So, one of the really important things that we need to think about is that on most deployment zones, the objectives are about 9 inches away from our deployment zone, which means that we need something that has access to move to get onto these objectives. Here, the Bulgrin that we had hiding in our castle can move into the center of the map without advancing with a move. This will be able to score as Secure No Man's Land, Extend Battle Lines, Area Denial, and Establish Locus. However, sometimes we need to be able to stand on multiple objectives, especially for things like Cleanse or Secure No Man's Land. Here, these Bulgrin, without advancing, can get onto this objective with move, which allows us to cover a lot of our bases. Here, we also have the Hellhound, such that it can move relatively easily into a position where it is possible to do containment. It's also worth noting that on the same deployment, we have Gaunt's Ghost set up on the other side of our deployment zone, ready to do the exact same thing. All of these things that we've shown are easily done not only by the units that we've shown, but by Catachan, Chimeras, Scout Sentinels, really anything that's relatively cheap. Especially for some of these action secondaries where if we move out there, we're very likely to die immediately afterwards. But the big question I want to ask right now, we generally deploy with these secondaries in mind, but we don't generally deploy it with bring it down or no prisoners in mind. And I want to ask the question, why don't we do that? Now with our secondary scoring taken care of, we need to put everything else in our army in a position where we would really like it to be able to move into the places we want to on turn 1. And the easiest way to think about that is we have to think about where we want our models to be on turn 1, and then reverse engineer from there. So this is an example of some kind of default movements that I will intend to do, not taking into account any secondary cards I might have drawn. And the next part of this is going over why these units are generally where they are. Note that a lot of these positions are approximate, and there are many subtleties in the movement throughout the course of this video that we just do not have time to cover. So especially for some of our new players, one of the things I would really recommend is pausing the video right now and ask yourself a couple of questions. If you had the exact same list as I did, is this what you would have expected to do with your movement? What would you have done differently? And then ask yourself, once you've answered that, would this change if I'm playing against World Eaters? Would this change if I'm playing against Tau? Would this change if I'm going first? Would this change if I'm going second? Once you have some of these ideas in mind, come back towards the rest of the video and we'll talk about why I did a lot of the things that I end up doing. But before we talk about the specifics of that, I want to talk about one of the most important concepts, especially for the guard. And the first one is understanding firing lanes. If you're playing on player-placed terrain where it changes every time, you're going to have to do this when you get to the board, after the terrain has already been set up. However, if you're doing this on any kind of tournament terrain like WTC, Games Workshop, or UKTC, or one of the many others that are out there, this is work that you can do before you even get to the tournament. It's important to understand what firing lanes exist on the board because it is going to differ even on the exact same terrain layout depending on how all of your deployment zones end up being set up. In this one, there are 7 important firing lanes to know how to play around on this deployment and terrain combo. And some of the most important ones are green and blue. Green is the easiest firing lane for us to shoot at our opponent's natural objective. And the inverse is true, where blue is the easiest place where our opponent can shoot at our natural objective. This is really important if you ever want to play a game of primary denial where you just want to shoot them off an objective. Orange and red are of secondary importance. It's generally relatively easy for opponents to hide from these firing lanes. However, as I'll talk about a little bit later in the video, they are very important for controlling these very large no man's land areas where there's not a lot of cover in the middle of the board. After that, yellow and purple are mostly important for just controlling the center of the board. Any game of 40k will generally have some combat taking place in the middle of the board, and being able to control that is really important. Also, because of how important blue firing lane is for our opponent and green firing lane is for us, it's a very natural position where we can shoot our opponents off of that firing lane to give us more safety on our own natural objective. One of the last things to think about for this is understanding the range of weapons that are going to be put in each of these firing lanes. Green and blue are relatively short, so things like Meltas are going to be pretty good. However, orange and red are very long, so these are places where you might want to put your plasma cannons instead of multi-Meltas. The Kofi question here, which firing lanes are more important for us to control? And the inverse, which of them are more important to prevent our opponent from controlling? With all that in mind, let's start talking about the places where we actually start putting our units. The first one that we're going to be looking at is a Rogel Dorn that is currently sitting around the intersection of orange and blue. If you need a reminder, you can see them up in the top right. Well, in this specific video, it happens to be a Rogel Dorn. In your own games, it's very normal to put maybe 2 Lehman Russes in this exact same spot. It's important to control this area because, one, you can hide from most of the firing angles that your opponents might be going for. But it's very easy for this Rogel Thorn or Lehman Russes in this spot to move between red, blue, orange, and yellow firing angles. In general, you want to be able to put your vehicles in a position where they can move into any of these firing lanes while also not being shot first. You don't want to be in a firing lane unless you are actively shooting down that lane. Just being in a firing lane without shooting, it means that your opponent is generally going to get to shoot you first. If it's safe to do so, and you don't have something else that you have your Rogel Thorn that you want to do, such as going for a sabotage or recover assets with it, especially on turn 1 where it can't really be shot, you can stick the barrel over the edge of the natural objective and still have the movement necessary to move into the yellow firing lane without using move, move, move. But ultimately, like we said, this can be any kind of direct fire tank. Just as we did with the first Rogel Dorn, we got to look at where the second Rogel Dorn is playing. Well, this Rogel Dorn doesn't have access to nearly as many firing lanes. It is ready to move into potentially our most important firing lane, which is green. It'll also challenge any of our opponent's vehicles that are playing in purple or blue. Just like we said with the other Rogaldorn, if you're running Lehman Russes, this can also be where your Lehman Russes will be standing. Potentially something shorter range, like a Demolisher, to shoot at our opponent's natural objective, and then something longer range, like a Lehman Russ Battle Tank or a Vanquisher, to shoot down the purple firing lane. Just like we said with the other Rogaldorn, this one should be standing in a position where it's very difficult or impossible for opponents to shoot. Next, the Lehman Russ Exterminator. This one is rather flexible, since the Exterminator is not only a decent damage dealer on its own, but it's also a major damage amp for the Rogaldorn, so it can double dip in the effective damage that it does. Because in this event it can move easily through the terrain gap here, this gives it very easy access to the yellow, purple, and orange firing lanes. However, this is a very flexible piece. Sometimes your opponents are going to overload towards the blue firing lane, and moving the Lehman Russ such that it can challenge for that firing lane earlier on can be way more important. It's a very flexible piece. It's not always going to play here. It's also very easy to have this Lehman Russ Exterminator not in this terrain footprint at all if it can drive directly over the terrain gap. And also remember, you can stick a tread or the barrel over the two pieces of terrain, and as long as it is on the other side of the obscuring terrain, you can draw line of sight from that. You do not have to be wholly within the terrain piece as long as you're sticking outside of it. But this is definitely a vehicle where I would consider going for some of the redeploys to make sure that it can respond to our opponent's major targets. Okay, next we're going to talk about the Bullgrin that are standing on our natural objective in the northwest. I'll say this right now, that in this particular example, they're Bullgrin, but if in your army you have Catachan or Chimeras, Kazarkin, or Scout Sentinels, or something cheap, you're generally going to want to put this out there first. However, you generally want to put 2 of those things on this objective just to make sure that if your opponent does damage to them, you're still going to be alive on this objective afterwards. The movement that you see here assumes a 3-inch advance roll, and move, 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 for a total of 12 inches of movement. Just like we said earlier, where so much of our focus on our deployment and our turn 1 movement is what we want to look like going into turn 2, in order to score primary, we need to be touching this objective. Most, but not all missions are going to care if you hold 1 and 2 objectives, and this is our easiest one to stand on. Just like we touched on earlier, special shout out to Scott Cairns, the Rogaldorn can also be touching this objective as well, adding both OC and a strong overwatch threat that our opponent might have to deal with. In general, just as we said before, you want to make sure that anything that you put here is going to be entirely out of the red firing lane. And ideally, you'd like to also stay out of the blue firing lane. And that's the natural question. Why is it so important to stay out of firing lane blue if our opponent can move over the terrain? Because in the Games Workshop Pariah Nexus terrain, the blue pieces of terrain are ones that are 2 inches in height or lower, so anything in the game can just drive over it. So overall, these are the major things that we care about in terms of understanding the firing lanes, where we can both use them to our advantage and try and make sure that we aren't getting shot at through them. But let's go ahead and talk about the other major part of the game. While a lot of guard lists are going to do most of their damage through the shooting phase, we still need to be ready to charge. If we have something like Bullgrin or Rough Riders, we can use this to do some damage. However, even if we're playing Kazarkin or Catachan or Cadians, they need to be ready to charge at different objectives depending on what the actual game is. In this particular example for terrain, there are not a lot of natural staging locations that matter, but the ones that do exist are very powerful. In the list that I'm bringing, remember that Bullgrin have access to move, move, move from Lord Solar, so if we want to charge any of these distances, we should take the distance that you see on the screen and subtract 10 from it. 9 inches for their movement, and then 1 inch for the engagement range. Other units, like Rough Riders, have even longer range, but because they cannot walk through walls, you do have to fudge it a little bit and try and figure out exactly what the threat range of your Rough Riders would be if they are staging in the same places. But we have to remember that our opponents are also trying to use these staging locations to try and take us down at the same time. I'm going to ask probably the toughest question right here: which side of the wall do we want our opponents to be when they charge us? So a lot of games, you do not have a choice on whether or not you're going to get charged, but you can decide where you want to be charged. With these staging locations in mind, let's take a look at how we're using one of them. The Bullgrin in this example have moved behind this L piece of terrain but are not standing in it, which means that they are functionally impossible to shoot at. However, there is a lot of nuance to this position. The important general concept I want to put in all of your minds is that this general area is really, really safe for a lot of our units to be. We currently have Bullgrin here, but this could very easily be Kazarkin and the Chimera, a couple of Scout Sentinels, Armored Sentinels, normal dudes, just Cadians running around, some more of our tanks if we're playing even more vehicles. It's a very safe place to be, but there is a ton of nuance to playing around this particular L. One of the natural things that you might be asking is, do we want to put these Bullgrin, potentially advance them such that they can touch the middle objective on our side of the wall? And the answer to that is sometimes. Not only does that threaten to hold 1, hold 2 for 3 on take and hold, but it also limits our opponent's ability to score air denial. The flip side to that is it gives our opponent a very easy potential storm hostile objective. It also gives them a target that they can shoot at for overwhelming force. It also puts us closer to our opponents, so armies like War Leaders might really enjoy the fact that we are now closer to them and they can actually get their charges off. We'll pose the next question: what would cause you to move these Bullgren onto the center objective, and instead of staging behind the terrain entirely, to stage right next to the wall? The other major place that we need to be aware of to go for some screening is the spot in the orange firing lane. Now, the movement you see here assumes that we gave them move, 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 and advanced only 1 inch. Ideally, you'd like to tuck them up right against the wall for the maximum threat range. However, this one has a ton of nuance. Depending on how your opponent deploys and how much shooting they have, you have to ask yourself, where is my opponent going to be able to shoot these guys from? The only real places they can shoot from are the purple firing lane and the orange firing lane, and sometimes from the green firing lane as well. It's usually fairly easy to get this unit of Bullgren out of the purple firing lane if you roll more than a 1 on an advance roll. But if you want to stay out of the orange firing lane, you might instead want to hide behind this little ruin down in the south. Now, here's a bit of an easier question then. In my original deployment, these Bullgren were hiding where you currently see Lord Solar on the left. What would cause you to put the Bullgren right on the line in the open where they are guaranteed to be able to get to the wall with a move, move, move? Next, this Hellhound is a very flexible piece, and this is one of many places where you can consider putting it. The Hellhound can do a lot of things for us because it's just a stat block. You can use it for screening, you can charge it into your opponents to be annoying with it and tank shock them, you can amplify the damage of your Exterminator and the Rogal Dorns, and it's 2 OC and it's reasonably fast. Regardless of where you put it, make sure you put the Hellhound in a position where it is going to get cover. But there's a bunch of questions that we have to ask ourselves. 1, do we ever want to put this on our opponent's natural objective? If we can do this to deny primary and going into their turn 2, it can oftentimes be worth it, especially if they put something small like a Chimera, which is only 2 OC, or maybe some like lone op character that's oftentimes OC 1 or 2. We can use the Hellhound to deny some of our opponent's primary. Otherwise, this Hellhound can very naturally move directly up against the same wall we talked about with the Bullgren, depending on whether or not our opponent's going to be able to shoot us from purple firing lane or orange firing lane. However, just like we mentioned with the Exterminator, this Hellhound could very plausibly be moved to the other side of the board where Gaunt's Ghosts were initially deployed. But if you do that, just make sure you deploy something else over on this side of the board such that you can still score things like containment and don't give up 3 free points. The Kofi question for this one: do you want the Hellhound in front of or behind the Bullgren? Is there a reason to ever put this on your opponent's natural that you can think of beyond just denying them primary? The last real piece that we have in this particular list as an example is Gaunt's Ghosts. Now again, we said we did all this movement assuming we didn't draw any secondaries. You will be drawing secondaries. However, you want to be able to move Gaunt's Ghost into a position like this, even if you go first where they cannot use their up-down ability. A major reason for this is Gaunt's Ghosts take up a ton of space if you don't have anything that they need to be doing. And the only things that Gaunt's Ghost tends to do is they tend to run around and score secondaries. And 2, they shoot at cultists. Sometimes you'll have Larkin or Bragg shoot at something a little bit bigger, but that's usually as a function of, hey, we're already standing in this place, and we can also happen to shoot that guy anyway. This is really important to put this here because our opponent is going to have a lot of 9-inch deep strikes, the ability to bring in reserves on turn 2, and just making sure that we can zone them out by using this unit is a fantastic tool. The other thing to think about, if the ghosts are doing a secondary, because you went second and they actually can do something on turn 1, you can move a tank into this zone, such as the Rogal Door, in order to screen all of these deep striking abilities. Also, the Exterminator can be here. But what other good units, if you were to build a different list, would be things that naturally want to stand here anyway? Now, I want to address some general, frequently asked questions that I hear from a lot of newer players especially. Firstly, why am I not putting anything on the middle objective? Well, the easy answer to this is they're probably just going to die for free. The most compelling reason we have to put something on the middle objective is if a secondary told us to do so, such as extend battle line, secure no man's land, area denial, or establish locus. Those are all reasons to be in the middle. However, turn 2 is generally the most potentially deadly turn in the game because your opponent should have almost their entire army ready to go. Anything that they did not lose on turn 1 is now in a position to potentially do damage on turn 2. So anything on the middle objective that is not standing behind a wall is very likely to die. Second, who is Lord Solar ordering? You have a lot of units that only he can order, especially in this list. And the answer is, it depends. On turn 1, I'm sure you noticed that I mentioned that all of these Bullgren are moving with move, move, move in mind. And in general, that should be the go-to. By default, Lord Solar is going to be ordering Bullgren or vehicles move, move, move because they don't have anything to shoot. If they do, your opponent has probably made a mistake. In turn 2 onwards, it's usually going to be your damage dealers, where he starts going from move, move, move to take aim for things like the Rogal Dorns and Leman Russ Exterminator. If you're running a lot of Leman Russes, it's going to generally be take aim on those Lehman Russes. But importantly, he shifted a little bit. He's still screening the majority of our backline, and his 24-inch range can easily order anything on any of the 3 no man's land objectives. Lastly, why did we not put anything on our opponent's natural objective? Well, the answer is you can. But most missions that are currently in the Pariah Nexus mission pack are only care if you hold 1 objective and hold 2 objectives. Depending on the mission, we might try to deny this objective, but it's rare. If this list had something like more Catachan or a cheap Chimera or anything that I don't really care if it lives or dies, and I can deny my opponent's primary on turn 2, it's a very natural way to do it. But generally in the guard, we are focused on trying to deny our opponent's primary a little bit later on. But if our opponent allows us to do it on turn 2, we're going to do it. So how do we play from here? Our general game plan is to hold our home objective and our natural objective for the entire game. And we're going to ask our opponent some important questions. Firstly, how are they going to stop us from doing that? Guard is a pretty good army at scoring secondaries because we tend to have a lot of cheap things that can run around. We have Catachan and Chimeras, we have small units of Scions, we have Gaunt's Ghosts. If we need Bulgrin or Lehman Russes to do these objectives, we can do that too, just because we have so many of them. The other major question we're asking our opponent is, we have now put our melee threats into a position where they can hit a lot of our opponent's army on turn 2 or maybe turn 3. What are they going to do when we have 18 of these big fat idiots charging their lines? We're also going to ask our opponent, because we've taken up so much of this board space, where they're going to bring in their reserves. The guard, in general, tends to excel when we can play a front-to-back style of game, where our front line is hitting their front line, and our back line is hitting their front line, and their back line is hitting our front line. If we can do that, we're usually going to come out on top because of how efficient and how strong a lot of our damage-dealing tanks are. Later in the game, while we start off with using Bulgrin or Catachan or Chimeras to stand objectives on turns 1, 2, 3, in turns 3, 4, 5, it becomes way more common for us to stand with Rogel Thorns and Lehman Russes on these objectives, especially as our opponent starts losing access to anti-tank. But in general, our units are generally either cheaper or more durable, or sometimes both, than our opponent's units. And that means we will generally look to win trading games. If you have to devote a Predator to kill my unit of Catachan, and then my Lehman Russ kills your Predator, well, I just traded positively about 50 points worth of things. And we tend to have more things, so our opponent cannot take that kind of even trade. They have to really try and be aggressive into us. It's also important to note general places where we would expect to be bringing in reserves units, like Rough Riders or Scions, or sometimes Lehman Russes. These green areas that I've marked are places where I would expect my Scions to deep strike on turns 2 or 3, where in particular, they are going to be able to drop into these locations and shoot anything that is on an objective where they are at their most useful. However, if you're running something like Rough Riders, which are fantastic rapid ingress threats, you have to think about where you would do them. The natural spots on this terrain pack to actually rapid ingress Rough Riders are generally behind these small ruins on the north and south. But you have to ask the same question for your opponents. Where are they likely to go for deep strikes? Where are they likely to go for rapid ingresses? And how can we prevent them from doing them in places that are useful? I'm not going to say that this general game plan I've laid out for you here is going to win you all of your games. It's not. 40k is simply a much more complicated game than that. However, like I said, if you're playing a general list where most of your damage is going to be coming from direct firing tanks, and you have some kind of idiots, whether they be big fat ones in Bulgrin, or small skinny ones in Cadines and Catachan, this kind of general game plan is going to win you a lot of games. If you were to take this exact list and basically blindly do exactly what I did in this game, of course scoring your secondaries on turn 1 if you can, you're probably going to go 2-1 at an RTT. Because, to quote Nick Jagiello, my game plan is stronger than theirs. Before we close out, I've moved this to the end of the video, so I do want to give a couple of shoutouts. Firstly, if you are interested in seeing what kind of lists our strong players are currently bringing, make sure you check out the Ko-fi page as well, where the answers will also be. And so if you're interested in taking a look at what the meta evolution is going to be, especially as we start looking for the September data slate, go ahead and check it out in the Ko-fi page in the description. Secondly, shout out to everyone who's become a member of the channel. It means a lot that the work that I've put into this hobby is useful for so many of you. If you're not already part of the Discord, make sure you tune in. The password is still Catachan. If you send me that on either Reddit or Discord, I will go ahead and send you an invite. If you do already have Discord, there's a gear on the desktop app where you can go ahead and click, and you're going to be looking for the connections settings. And if you're there, you should be able to scroll down and find the join button, and it'll automatically add you to the Discord. If you are a member, you get access to our special members lounge, where I will give you guys some ideas of what's going on in the content pipeline, things that I'm currently working on, as well as getting to see things early. It's also the first place I'll go to when I'm doing things like List Doctor. So if you want to have a say in what the future of the channel is going to look like, that's the best way to do it. Lastly, for some upcoming events that I'm planning to go to in the next month or so, I'm going to There Is Only War in Phoenix, Arizona. Big shout out to Jason Flanzer and the TO team at Gamers Guild. I'm also going to SoCal Open Teams in San Diego with the Get Hammer lads. I'm going to the California Cup, also in San Diego, which is a singles event. And then I'm also really looking at going to the Battle Shock event in San Francisco, California. If it gets to 25 entrants, I'll go because it means that I can actually earn some ELO off of that event. Overall, though, this has been us talking about the default game plan of the Guard. I'd love to hear what other questions you guys have, and hopefully this has been helpful. Remember, everything I talked about in this video, don't look at these specifics as much as understand the principles. Look for those firing lanes. Look for those places where you're going to be staging your armies. See if you can do this work before you actually get to your games. As long as you understand these general principles, it will help you not only deploy better, it'll make your turn 1 go faster, and it'll help you play on the clock because you don't need to think nearly as much about what you're doing when you actually get to the table. For now, though, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Officer Training School. If you like this video, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps with the algorithm. And let me know if you want to see more videos like this. It's possible to do this with pressure lists or artillery lists as well, as long as you have the right kind of understanding of how you're going to be winning these games. But for now, this has been Joshua Joushi Howard talking about the default game plan of the Guard. We'll see you guys all next time. Bye-bye.